Jasmine.
Good afternoon. If we have any guests today who have not been in this building before, I need to tell you that there are two emergency exits, should they be needed. One, of course, is in the back of the room by the doors you entered. The other is accessible by a staircase behind our speakers and to your left side of the stage. My name is Bob Strong. I'm a member of the politics department here at Washington and Lee, and I'm honored to introduce this afternoon's event. In the fall of 1972, as Washington and Lee's class of 1976 was arriving on campus, two new students began what might be an unlikely friendship. One, Ken Ruscio, came from New Jersey. The other, Mike Luttig, different political views, eventually the same long hair. As freshmen, they lived on the fourth floor of Gillum Dormitory. Later, they both served as dormitory counselors. They were both made members of ODK. They were both recorded in the college edition of Who's Who. After graduation, their lives took different paths. J. Michael Luttig worked in the White House and for the Supreme Court before attending the University of Virginia's School of Law. He clerked for then Judge Antonin Scalia and for Supreme Court Justice Warren Burger. He was assistant counsel to President Ronald Reagan and assistant attorney general for the Office of Legal Counsel under President George Herbert Walker Bush. In 1991, he was appointed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. He served on that court with distinction until 2006, when he left public service to work in the private sector. As you undoubtedly know, Judge Luttig played a role in the events of January 6, 2021. He helped to convince Mike Pence that the vice president had no authority to reject legitimate electoral college votes and overturn the 2020 presidential election. Subsequently, he gave compelling testimony to the Congressional Committee investigating the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Since then, he has expressed his concerns about the future of American democracy in articles, interviews, and public lectures. Ken Ruscio earned advanced degrees from Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. After postdoctoral research at UCLA, he taught at Worcester Polytechnic Institution and Kansas State University. In 1987, he returned to Washington and Lee, where he held positions as Professor of Politics, Associate Dean of the Williams School, and Dean of Freshmen. In 2002, he was named the Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies at the University of Richmond. 4 years later, Ken was back in Lexington to serve as Washington and Lee's 26th president. His longtime friend and classmate, Mike Luttig, spoke at his inauguration. This afternoon, you get to hear and join a conversation between Judge Luttig and Dr. Ruscio, Mike and Ken, two graduates of Washington and Lee, two friends for half a century, two accomplished students of American politics, leadership, and law, and two citizens concerned about the challenges facing our nation today. Join me in a warm welcome for Mike and Ken.
Well, thank you, Bob. Can you all hear me okay? We have these kind of invisible mics, so we're hoping that they work, and they seem to work just fine. And Mike and I are going to have just a really good conversation, maybe some serious topics along the way for sure, and maybe some insight into some of the decisions he made. But first, Mike, I don't want you to take it personally that your introduction started with advice to the audience about how to leave. You know, the exits are in the back, and So we just have to, and the Gillum dorm thing, Bob mentioned that we spent our freshman year on the fourth floor of Gillum dorm, and that during my presidency we tore it down. That the National Historic Landmark approval just did not go as I'd hoped, so I'm sorry about that.
You know, Ken, since you've opened the door to comments about Bob's introduction, I was just going to say that I would translate Bob's introduction of Ken and I into English this way. Despite all the flowery language and the flourish, what Bob really said was that please welcome two very old former students of Washington. That's all he really said. So.
Who could still make it up the stage without assistance, if I might. So Mike, you're right. 50 years ago, we started out here as freshmen, and it's hard to imagine here we are. We didn't get very far. We got from about there to here, but we somehow managed. So look, we're going to get to a lot of topics, mainly focused on the role that you're playing right now in democracy. But first, how's retirement going for you?
Well, I thought I had retired 3 years ago, and from Boeing after 15 years, but that did not go so well. I was willing to retire, even enthusiastic about the possibility, until 1 year later, almost to the day, I got a call from the Coca-Cola company, and it was around December 27th, and this is December 27th of 2020, therefore 1 week before the fateful January 6th that we're going to talk about. And the board asked me if I would be interested in coming to work for the company. And I said, yes, I would. And they said, well, can you start Monday, the Monday after Christmas? And as it was, I ended up starting with the Coca-Cola company the morning of January 6, 2021.
Wow, wow. So let's not jump into January 6th quite yet, because I think I want to lay the groundwork a little bit. The call that you got on January 4th from the Vice President's office set in motion a series of things, but it wasn't like you were randomly chosen from the phone book on January 4th for that call. That call came to you for a particular reason. And you've mentioned to me, and you mentioned to the students in class yesterday, that there comes a time when there appears to be a very hard decision that someone has to make. But actually, that decision is made long before that moment. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yes, with this preface to that story, into the wee hours of the morning that I testified last summer in June, to the chagrin of the Congress, I was not working on my testimony. I was instead working on something that was far more important to me, and that was an essay for the New York Times on heroism and the heroes of January 6th. So that's all I wanted to talk about that day of my testimony, although I spoke about much more later in the day. But I had some ideas that I had been thinking about literally since my first day on campus at Washington and Lee about leadership and eventually heroism. And so in that essay that I wrote and that was published the next day in Politico and the New York Times, I made the point that Ken references. And it was, at the time, the most important point that I wanted to make for myself, but also to the nation. and it went something like this, as finally written. There comes a time in every life, public or private, when one is called upon to stand, affirm, and bear witness to what he believes and what he does not believe. If he answers that call, then he is a hero. Whether he be a hero only to himself, to his family, to his community, or indeed to his nation. And going back to the class that I attended yesterday, I told the class, with respect to those words, that in the past 2 years, my entire life has come full circle. Full circle from my time at Washington and Lee. I came here with the values that were those of Washington and Lee University, but I came here in order to hone and perfect and nurture those values, because that's what Washington Lee purported to offer Ken and I, and even those of you here today, and that is leadership. And of course, that leadership begins with the character and the values that are inculcated here, first in your home with your parents, and then here at Washington and Lee, and then out in the real world you go. But all of this tonight for me comes around to that last thought, that 50 years from now, each one of you will be in precisely the same situation that Ken Ruscio and I are in tonight. And along the way, you will have had 1, 2, 3, probably not more, opportunities to stand, affirm, and bear witness to what you believe and what you don't believe. And if you do, you will be a hero to yourself, most importantly.
Good. So I'm going to get you to that evening in January. But so Washington and Lee, and as former president, I appreciate your answer to the leading question that I asked about your influence of your alma mater, so thank you very much.
You're the first person that's ever asked a judge a question. We normally ask you the questions,
Right.
but you're in a privileged status tonight.
Well, we got that figured out pretty easily. So W&L has an influence on how you think about things. Later, though, you end up embarking on this judicial career. And some of the first steps include clerking at the appeals level for one Antonin Scalia, followed by clerking for a few years, actually, for one Warren Burger. I know they were intellectual influences on you, but I know also they were influences on your character and how you thought about things. Can you just talk a little bit about their influence on you?
Well, again, I came from Tyler, Texas with the values that are Washington and Lee, and I took away from Washington and Lee those same values that had been reinforced and further refined. And I went out into the real world, like all of you are going to do one of these days, to a world that's very different. Today, for instance, I've written most recently that we no longer prize at all the virtues that are Washington and Lee and that are all of us. Indeed, we prize the very opposite of those virtues. That's the world you're going to walk into. But it was not always so. In particular, when Ken and I left, we walked out into a frightening world that was largely prepared to reinforce the same values that we had learned at home and here at Washington and Lee, in contrast to today. And so the transition and the further development of character was of a same piece with what I had grown up with and learned here. So it was not a traumatic or dramatic change. Indeed, I wanted to work first with Scalia, first actually, now that I think about it, I wanted to work first with Warren Burger because he was at the time the Chief Justice of the United States, and he was the personification in the law of all that we're talking about here. And by the way, this is kind of an interesting, I never wanted to be anywhere near politics, and actually don't want to be near politics today, 69 years old. But I've been thrust into it of late, but only for the first time. But my first job, really, out of law school was at the White House in Ronald Reagan's administration. I worked in the White House counsel's office. But I didn't want to stay there any longer than was necessary until I could get out and back on to the judicial path. And so when Scalia was nominated by the president, I saw that as my opportunity to slide over and clerk for him after having worked at the White House for, I think, 2 years or 2 years plus. And so I did, and then clerked for him for 1 year, and then went back to the Supreme Court as a law clerk for Warren Burger, for whom I had worked 2 to 3 years previously in an administrative capacity. But as Ken, the distinction Ken has asked us to draw is between the intellectual experience and the character building experience. So as to the latter, Scalia, too, at a younger age than Warren Burger, was at that time already the personification of the traditional conservative values that all of us grew up with at the time and that we were familiar with. So I wanted to work for him first and foremost for that reason, and did, and then returned to Warren Burger, where he, under his tutelage, I further refined to a fare thee well what were to be my views and values and beliefs for the remainder of my life.
Great. So,
but let me add. So what's the moral of that story? From my view, the moral of the story is that it's of the utmost importance always, from high school on, who you associate with and who you choose to be friends with. Utmost importance. And as parents in the room can tell you, there's hardly anything more important to parents than who you young people associate with, beginning in high school all the way through your lives. So to put the point to it, you should always give great consideration to that before you even begin a friendship with someone. I am touched beyond words that some of my best friends in life, who I made friends with here at Washington Lee, are here tonight. And they are the examples of that in my life. 50 years later, almost 50 years to the day, the 3 or 4 of us, and I see, John and Jeff here too, I hadn't seen before, it is as if we never left Washington and Lee. We can pick up the conversation that trailed off 50 years ago and continue it today as if we had never separated.
Yeah. One of the reasons that we started just a few minutes late is someone who shall go nameless in the communications office about a month or so ago discovered our 1976 Calyx yearbook picture that included Art Wood, who's here tonight, Mike, and I. And so one of the projects we had right before was to recreate that picture on, as it turns out, on the porch of the Lee House.
To the extent that was possible.
Well, it was remarkable how easy it was because we had changed so little. And Kevin Remington, the university photographer, asked a couple of us to cross our legs, and that was a little bit difficult for us. So let's, it really is, and I look out and I see people like Harrison and Art Wood and folks like that. It's great to see you all. So let me go back. You mentioned in passing, quite quickly, but I think directly, I have stayed out of politics, and there was a certain characterization of politics that came through in your voice. I have stayed out of politics, you said with a sneer, your entire
Yes, I
life.
did.
I know.
So be careful what you ask for.
Right. So, but on a serious note, why?
Yeah.
I mean, you went the judicial route for a particular reason. Why?
Yeah, on the most serious note possible, I have never had respect for politics, with a small p, that is the way it's practiced, as opposed to the capital P, as it's framed in the Constitution of the United States. And I've had, if possible, less respect for politicians. And if it's possible to have the least respect possible for politicians, then that's where I am today after these past 2 years. Everything that I stand for, I consider to be antithetical to politics, or vice versa, I should say. And so it wouldn't be much overstatement to say that I planned my entire life so that I would never be in the presence or confronted with or have to work within politics. So little respect I had. Now, I don't hold it against Ken that he was the opposite, and he's been a political person and fascinated and interested and enticed into politics. I don't hold that against him necessarily, but it's a different path to me. And so what is the legal, judicial, non-political path? In my words, it is truth, honesty, directness. It is humility. It is courage at all times, in all places, with everyone. If you're a federal judge, it is simply not an option under your constitutional oath to do anything but that. So what does that come down to? Judges write opinions. And they write opinions on the most controversial political issues of our times. And they do that every day. And never should there be even a thought much less a word of politics in that judicial opinion, or frankly, in that judicial thinking.
So not a very charitable view of politicians. I suppose a kind of skeptical view of the collective wisdom of the people at times. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm going to leap ahead in a thought.
Well, no.
Okay.
Because, you did put words in my mouth, and they're words that I don't want in my mouth.
Yeah, well, I've
Because
done that for a while, but yeah.
You segued from politicians to the people.
Yeah.
And as to the people and for the people, I have the greatest respect possible. And incidentally, that's the view of the Constitution of the United States. In a word, all power in the United States comes from the people of the United States. And it's loaned, if you will, to our public officials in Washington, D.C. during good behavior. And as soon as they do not serve us, the Constitution provides that we take back that power that we loan to them and confer it upon someone else.
Okay. So I am going to come back to that later on in a different context. But now, let's turn to January 4th, because that's, I think, when you got the call. And as you said, some of the hard part of your decision was made years and years ago as it built up. And you were asked to provide a certain piece of advice and guidance for the Vice President of the United States. I take it that was not the challenge on January 4th, but the challenge was to try to figure out how to tweet it. Can you, you've told that story before, but I think it's worth retelling.
Yeah,
The challenges that democracy faces depended on your ability to tweet.
well, framed that way, I guess that is a story for posterity. I had never thought of it quite like that. But these were the facts. First off, this was the most serious moment in my life, and it would have been the most serious moment in anyone's life, anywhere, at any time. I was aware, just like all of you were aware of what was going on. Then President Trump was demanding that his vice president essentially overturn the election 2 days thence at the time. And I got the first call of 2 on the night of January 4th, and I was with my wife, Elizabeth, and we were out in Colorado. And the Vice President's counsel asked me if I knew John Eastman. And I said, yes, I do. And he says, well, what do you think about him? And I said, well, John clerked for me about 25 years ago. He was brilliant, is brilliant. He's a constitutional scholar of the highest order. And he's also a constitutional historian, probably without equal. Why do you ask? And he said, you don't know, do you? And I said, no, I don't. And he said, well, John was in the Oval Office this afternoon with the president and vice president, and he told the president and the vice president in so many words that the vice president could overturn the election in the day after tomorrow. And I said, well, you can tell the vice president that I said he has no such authority or power at all. And Richard, a longtime friend, said, I told him that, and he knows that that's your view. And I said, well, okay. And we hung up, and my wife, who had been overhearing all this, said something like, oh my God, what was that? And so I repeated what she hadn't heard on the other end of the phone, and she said, you have to stop this. You have to stop this somehow. Do you understand what this would mean for America? And I said, I do, but there's nothing I can possibly do. Well, throughout the rest of the evening, she pled with me to do something. And I pled with her back that there was just simply nothing I could do. I had nothing whatsoever to do with it. And then came the call the next morning.
Yeah. And so then you had to make that statement, or you wanted to make that statement. And the vice president's office wanted you to make that statement public. Is that correct?
Well, it's more interesting than even that. So the call came very, very early Colorado time on January 5th, the day before January 6th, and from Richard. And he said, Judge, we have to do something immediately. And I said, well, Richard, what do you even mean? And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, if you don't know, am I supposed to know what we need to do? And he said, you have to get your voice out across the country immediately. And I said, Richard, I don't even know what that even means. I'm retired. I'm out in Colorado. I'm basically retired on vacation. I don't even have a box of stationery. And if I could write it out on a letter, I wouldn't even know who to send it to. And no one cares what I think anyway. He said, I'll call you back in 5 minutes. He calls back in 5 minutes and says, have you thought of what to do? And I said, no, I've only had several sips of coffee, but no. He says, I'll call you back in 5 minutes more. He calls back and he says, we do not have much time left. What are you going to do? And I said, Richard, I don't know. He says, I'll give you 10 minutes. So he calls back in 10 minutes and he says, have you thought of what to do? And I said, well, I created an account on Twitter last few weeks, but I don't know how to tweet. And he says, perfect. And I said, perfect, what did you not understand? I don't know how to tweet. And he said, tweet fast and let me know as soon as you tweet it. And I said, and this is why I wanted to go down this path, I said, listen, Richard, I will never speak one syllable that's not approved by the vice president. I said, do you understand this is one of the gravest moments in history? And Richard says, no, we don't have time, just do it. And I said, no. And he says, I'll call you back in 5 minutes. He calls back in 5 minutes and says, the vice president will be comfortable with anything you say. And I said, I do not want to do this, but on that I will. So I went down to my office there in Colorado, and I didn't know how to tweet at all, much less how to tweet more than 140 characters or whatever they allow you, But I have a millennial son who's tech inspired, and so I call him and I say, John, I got to tweet something important, but I don't know how to tweet. Just like any millennial of all the parents in this room, he goes, Dad, I don't have time for this. I've been telling you and Mom for years that you're going to have to learn this. and then this is where the wisdom of age and experience comes in. I thought to say, let me tell you something. You either tell me how to do this or I'll cut you out of the will. And of course, he groused about that and his so-called autonomy from us as parents. And I said, I don't really care about your autonomy. And he said, the instructions are in your email. I opened the email. Sure enough, the official Twitter instructions were there. And I followed them and tweeted. And as soon as I tweeted, I had no thought at all even what I was doing or whether anyone in the world would ever see this. And I tweeted it, sent it to Richard Cullen. He called me back 10 minutes later and said, your tweet's on the front page of the New York Times. And I said, Richard, just leave me alone.
And then, of course, comes the morning of January 6th. And there's still question about what the vice president is going to do. But the vice president puts out a statement at that point.
So my wife and I, and this is the most, the saddest story for us of this whole saga. So I was still in my office working on something, and I got 2 successive emails from 2 of my former clerks. And each of them it was almost verbatim, each of them it said, Judge, what are you doing? And being me, I wrote back to them and I said, what are you doing? And they wrote back, they being them, and said, don't be coy with us. What are you doing? And I wrote back to them and I said, guys, I don't even know what you're talking about. And they said, the vice president just left the White House for the Capitol. They released his letter to the nation from the White House, and he cited you, saying that he would not overturn the election. That with the counting of the votes, which was to begin in 45 minutes. And that was the first time that I had any clue whatsoever that what I had tweeted, frankly, it even made its way to the Vice President of the United States. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, we know that he was waiting for that, and his people had the New York Times waiting for the tweet.
Yeah. Okay, so the Vice President does what he does upon your advice, but before he's actually able to fully do that, the Capitol is stormed. So you're there in Colorado with Elizabeth, and did you ever imagine that the scenes that we saw later that day would ever be seen here?
No. So it was around lunchtime in Colorado, and Elizabeth was over in the guest house making some lunch, and I think she may have called me, but I went over. And when I walked in, she said, "Are you watching?" And I said, "No. Watching what?" And she was more uptight and teary-eyed than I'd ever seen her, and she said, "The United States Capitol is under attack." And I said, "By whom?" And she said, "I don't know, but they're among other things, whoever has erected gallows on the lawn of the Capitol, and they're screaming, 'Hang Mike Pence.' And the banner running on underneath those photographs, some of them said that the vice president had acted on my advice. And Elizabeth was terrified and said, you know, we have to do something. We have to either leave here immediately or you have to get security here immediately. So we sat down and we talked about it and finally decided that no one knew we were in Colorado, but that we would take measures in Chicago where we live. But I've said this publicly for 2.5 years now, and so Elizabeth knows that I might say it tonight, but that she was terrified beginning that moment and has been terrified every moment since for 1.5 years now.
And I want to jump ahead. Gosh, I have so many things I want to ask, but I want to move to kind of the next chapter. I mean, you've had several chapters in here, but I want to move to the next chapter, which is the January 6th committee hearings and your testimony there, how that came about. But I guess the first question for that is, you were obviously aware of the historical significance and the particular role that you played in those particular hearings, the particular role that you were asked to play in those particular hearings. You've described yourself as a fact witness there. So tell us how the testimony came about. Tell us what was going through your head as you put it together about what you wanted to convey to the committee in that testimony.
So for security reasons, as much as for any other reason, I stayed in a home that we have in South Carolina for the 5 months leading up to my testimony in virtual isolation. Security reasons, but also because I knew what I had to do, and I wanted the time to do it right. And so every morning I would get up, every single morning at 5 o'clock, and I would read every single word that had been written overnight about the events of January 6th, the ongoing discussions, everything, so that I could begin afterwards that day thinking about what I would say in my testimony. And so it was a daily iterative process that went on 18 hours a day for 7 days a week, so that even if I was out at dinner or taking a walk, as my wife now hates, even when I'm asleep, the thoughts and the words that I want seem to appear. So if it's at night, I get up, and during this period and like periods, I might get up 6 or 8 times a night every few minutes in order to write down the words that have come to me in my sleep. So I was doing this for 5 months, leading up to it, to where, let's say, a week before or 2 weeks before I was to give the testimony, I had just all of these hundreds and hundreds of thoughts in almost the exact words that I wanted to relate them, just in random notes. So 2 weeks out, I had decided I would give myself 2 weeks, and then that at the appointed morning, I opened up all these notes and I started to compose the written testimony. And it actually, to do the first draft, it only took me about 24 or 48 hours straight. But I had at that point a draft that I would have submitted to the Congress. But to Ken's, main point, I was overwhelmed, as I had never been before, with the historic nature of what I was going to say. And I felt that I had an obligation to say that, all of that to the country. And the Congress had told me that I had that obligation. So I knew what I had to do. And so I did it. So, Ken, I'm sure is going to ask the next question, and in anticipation of that, I will
Don't
tell
you
you.
put words in my mouth.
So the last decision I made was not to give my testimony to the Congress in advance because of their politicians, and I was never going to trust them with anything, let alone this testimony. But the committee had called me a couple of days in advance, and I was in Tuscaloosa with our daughter, Morgan, an alumnus of W&L, and they called to go over with me the questions, the specific questions they were going to ask me. I didn't say this to them, although one of my former clerks was one of the senior staffers, but I didn't really care what they asked me. That's one of the most important things I've learned during this long life, is that I don't care what anyone's going to ask me. I'm going to say to them whatever I want to say to them, whether it's responsive to the question anyway. But I didn't tell them that. So I just went through all the questions, and they said, so, well, Judge, so give us a feel for what you'd say. And I would, I'd say something. That's all they knew until the night before I was about to testify. And then you can ask me that question or not. I don't care.
So what happened when they started asking you questions?
So we were at, Elizabeth and I were at the Hay Adams the night before. I think it may have been before you got there. I'm pretty sure. I got a call from the committee. And the committee said, Judge? I said, yes, committee? And they said, we've heard that you are going to give, they said, the most historic statement in Congress tomorrow that's ever been given. Is that true? And I said, yes, it's true. And they said, well, Judge, you don't understand. And I said, I think I understand probably better than all of you do. And they eventually said, we just can't, you just can't testify tomorrow without us knowing what you're going to say. And I said, well, I'm sorry. I will appear tomorrow if you want me to, and if you don't, that's fine with me too. And then in my favorite vignette, one of them said, well, Judge, if you don't give us your testimony within 24 or 48 hours, it will never be made part of the official record. And I kind of laughed and said, that's fine with me too, but you'll want this to be part of the record. And so we hung up, and I had already, in a very, very important decision that I had to make, I had given my testimony to CNN 24 hours prior, and so that they could do all of their programming and release my testimony at 6 a.m. the morning that I testified. And I didn't tell the committee that either. And so the morning that I testified, CNN, released my testimony to the nation, really. with this funny last little thing. I don't know how to do computers still. And for some reason that I think I'll never know at all, the final copy that I sent to CNN for release, on the bottom of every page said classified and confidential. And they called me in the middle of the night and said, Judge, you weren't going to believe this, but every page says it's classified document. And we've checked with our lawyers, we can't remove that classification without your permission. And I said, I don't even know what it is. I don't know how it got there. I said, but you have my permission, if you can, to get rid of it. And they said, thanks. And they never did. So my testimony was released to the country, marked classified, confidential, to be seen for your eyes only.
So your testimony, your statement, which in the aftermath of your appearance before the committee, I remember reading at least 3 or 4 different columns from editorial pages on saying everyone needs to read Judge Luttig's opinion or statement. Apart from what you said about January 6th and the direct words that you said about January 6th, you had references in there to, let me get this right so I don't put words in your mouth here. America is in a constitutional crisis. That was present tense at the time. You referred to the moral catatonic stupor America finds itself in today, reeling from twin wars, leaderless and rudderless. America is in need of help. Our polarized political leaders have shamefully and shamelessly failed us. They have summoned our worst demons at the very moment when we summoned our better angels. Do you feel any better after the hearings about where we are?
No, not yet. And of course, I've been asked that
Yeah.
many times, up to and including this past week. And the answer I've given ever since my testimony was essentially this, that if at any time, up to and including the day that I was asked, the former president and his Republican allies had even said January 6th was wrong, if either of those had ever said even once, Donald Trump lost the election fair and square, then I would have felt that in the end, all would be well. But of course, as we all know, it was just the opposite, and it was the opposite to this very day. This very day being a day when the former president, who incited an insurrection on the United States Capitol in order to prevent the counting of the electoral votes for the presidency of the United States, which he knew he had lost, is today, almost 3 years later, the presumptive Republican nominee for the presidency of the United States again. All the while, not one single Republican other than Liz Cheney has even as much as said Donald Trump did lose the 2020 election. And the insurrection on the United States Capitol was wrong. Not one.
So I'm mindful of our time, and I want to leave time for questions from some of you. So my last question, then we'll turn it back to some of you, is I want to go back to that question about your skepticism of politicians, your confidence in the American people. This will sound like a softball question, but I really don't mean it as a softball. Why is democracy worth defending? If politicians are politicians, if people can't see the fact of the 2020 election, if intellectually they can't see it, why would you have faith in democracy and find it worth defending?
There are two questions.
Yeah.
They're fundamentally different questions. But democracy is worth defending because democracy is literally the greatest method of governance, self-governance in the case of democracy, of any form of government that's ever been created in the history of civilization. And it's almost understatement to call it genius, but the genius of democracy is what I referred to at the beginning. All power, all of it, comes from we, the people. This government that we established in the Constitution to govern us has literally no power at all, except the power that we loan it temporarily. And so, this year, as I've spoken across the country, toward the end of my speeches, I've posed the question, our politicians having failed us, to whom do we turn? And I said, well, the answer is clear. It's in the first words of the Constitution. We turn to we, the people. We now must come to the aid of our struggling America. Now, the fact that politicians have failed us is a failure not of democracy, but failure of our elected officials to put the interest of the United States of America ahead of their own personal partisan interests. But let me emphasize that. This is literally what's at issue for the first time in my knowledge in all of American history. Okay? So we're not talking about general politics now. We're talking about a single event on a single day in all of American history. But during that day, the incumbent president of the United States tried to overturn the election of the American people. And he went so far as to incite an insurrection on the Capitol to prevent the counting of the votes. That is what I call a singular moment in all of history. And I'm as confident as I am of anything that this moment will never be repeated in all of history in the United States of America. And that's why I have eventually called this the gravest offenses possible by an incumbent president against the United States of America. Just so you know, if you say that out in ordinary conversation, a law professor might say, oh, but it's not treason. In my view, it's at least tantamount to treason, if not worse. And I eventually said that to some anchor in an interview. I said, what happened on January 6th was not treason per se, because treason's defined in the Constitution very narrowly. But I said, it is treason-like because it was a betrayal of the country.
Thank you. Let's turn it over to some of you for some questions. We have Amber over here and Brianna over here, and I'll confess we're going to give a little bias towards the students in the audience, but don't let that. Any questions for Judge Luttig?
Yes, sir.
I forgot to bring this up when we were together earlier. Former president used that independent state legislature theory to possibly provide electoral votes that might overturn the election. I know that there's been a lot of discussion about that. There was recently a case about that in North Carolina. Could you comment on what the status of that is and what your thoughts are moving forward?
Just quickly, first off, the so-called independent state legislature theory that the gentleman referenced, I called the centerpiece of the plan to overturn the 2020 election. Exceedingly complex, esoteric, known to only a handful of constitutional scholars, but including my former law clerk, who was the architect of the plan to overturn the election. In short, for even the lay audience, this is a theory of constitutional interpretation of the electors and the elections clauses of the Constitution. In the electors clause, which was at issue in the 2020 presidential election, what it meant was, if adopted, if it existed, if it had been approved by the Supreme Court, it would have meant that that Donald Trump could have had the state legislatures in the swing states appoint electors who would cast their votes for Donald Trump, notwithstanding that the people of that state had voted for Joe Biden. And so that's all we have time for right now, except the latter part of your question was, what's the status? Well, the Supreme Court refused to decide that question in December of 2020, knowing full well, just like all of us did, what was possibly to come in less than a month. And it declined to decide it with a split vote. January 6th occurred. All of us knew the Supreme Court eventually had to take the issue, and they took it in the context of an elections clause issue out of North Carolina, to which the gentleman referred. And so on December 7th, 2022, the Supreme Court argued that case, styled Moore versus Harper, and is scheduled to decide the independent state legislature question probably within a month now, though there have been questions raised now as to whether the court will proceed to decide the question, because a newly constituted North Carolina Supreme Court, understand, has switched in November elections from Democrat to Republican. The new Republican Supreme Court of North Carolina actually granted rehearing of the case and reversed the earlier North Carolina Supreme Court case. So the argument is being made in the Supreme Court of the United States now that the case there pending is moot.
Go ahead. Yeah.
If a future president of the United States called you and asked if you would be willing to accept a nomination to the Supreme Court, provided that you were confirmed, how would you respond to that question?
I've never been asked that question, but I'm pretty confident. I would say, without equivocation, thank you, Mr. President, but my wife will not allow me.
Wife, before you said that.
I wouldn't have to. And no, I wouldn't ask her in advance. I've made the mistake of asking a few too many questions in advance in the past 2 years. And I got an earful.
Other questions? Well, please join me in thanking Judge Luttig for spending time with us tonight. And we thank all of you for joining us, and I hope you have admired the way Mike and I have kept our composure during this whole thing. This has been very meaningful for us, and we thank you for being a part of it. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you.